From the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics and the Past with Rob Ferguson. And I am joined today by by Jake Dueck, who's been on the show lots before. And we've got Jake on the show because I've been away the last little bit, and Jack has been running the show, and he's done two excellent episodes on the Regents Cup debate
hmm
competition. And we weren't really going to do another episode on the Regents Cup. However, then we found out that our own Jake Dueck won the whole thing. He and his partner won the whole thing. So we have to bring Jake on to hear all about it and for us to give our official congratulations. Jake, congratulations. This is a massive victory.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm still kind of processing it. Uh, I've never really won anything like this before, so it's nice to actually see all the hard work that my partner and I put into this competition literally pay off.
That's wonderful. Yeah. So Arizona State University won the entire competition, but the
Correct.
Oxford debate format, which is one of the most important components of the overall thing, that particular contest was won by you and your partner. Tell me a little bit about your partner, Jake.
I've known Sam for almost 2 years now. We met in mock trial. So we go way back, and we were initially direct partners. So I was his first direct partner. We kind of like worked through the initial mock trial stuff together. But Sam and I, we were on a team for a full year, so we built a nice, strong friendship, especially going through something like mock trial. You can't really avoid something like that. We stayed in touch. We both share a major in political science, so we've seen each other in lots of different classes. And when I found out that Sam also got into the Regents Cup, I I fought pretty hard to make sure that we were partners because I had a feeling that we would work pretty well together.
Well, I mean, that clearly paid off. So, Jake, are you able to explain? I mean, people who've listened to this last couple episodes know a fair bit about the Regents Cup. Jack did a really good job explaining all of it, and the guests. But maybe for those who didn't get a chance to listen to those first two episodes, can you maybe explain a little bit about what the Regents Cup is, and then maybe talk a little bit about the Oxford debate?
I would love to. So, just to give the Spark Notes version, the Regents Cup is hosted by the Arizona Board of Regents, which is the governing body that controls ASU, U of A, and AU. And so it's a competition between those three public universities in Arizona. There are 12 teams for the Oxford debate, and then I forget how many storytellers, but you have two different formats in which you can compete: debate and storytelling. It's hosted once a year. Auditions are in the fall, and the competition itself is usually late March, early April, and we prepare in the remaining part of the spring semester that comes before the competition. So it's super, super cool. I really appreciate the event, especially because it focuses on fostering free speech and civil discourse and civility over relevant issues, which is a lot of what we do in the Politics and Leadership Club. So there's a nice amount of moral and philosophical overlap between what we do at the club and what we do at Regents Cup. And then for Oxford debate specifically, I think it's super, super fun just because it's almost it's the most freeform kind of debate competition that I've ever seen. I know a lot of people that have done like speech and debate in high school, and there are like lots of different rules and ways that you judge and ways that you compete. This one is very, very loose. So there are four resolutions that each team of two has to prepare for. You have to prepare a case in the affirmative of the resolution and the negative of the resolution. This year, the four resolutions were about AI, physician assisted suicide, social media, and voting. And they were very, very interesting, especially because the first three were especially policy oriented. So there was a lot of research that we had to do. But in terms of the actual rounds, you have the affirmation, you have the negation, you have a moderator, a panel of judges. Each side gives a 7 minute opening speech outlining their case. And then it's 30 minutes or 25 to 30 minutes of just open question and answer period or cross examination where the teams clarify their stances, ask questions of the other side. The judges might ask questions. It's very, very free form. And then each side has 5 minutes to make a closing statement to kind of sum that up. The scoring rubric is it's kind of intricate, kind of not. We're graded on how strong our arguments are, public speaking, the evidence we use, how much we're listening to the other side, how respectful we are. And based on what the judges say, you move on to the next round. So there are two preliminary rounds. Whoever wins the most points goes to the quarterfinals. And then it's process of elimination to the semifinals and then the finals. And that's
Okay.
kind of just the basic.
So you participated in five separate Oxford debates then to win this, correct?
Yes, it was pretty exhausting by the last one.
No kidding.
But yeah.
And so how long ahead of time do you know what your topic is going to be of, like what your resolution is going to be of the four and whether you're going to be on affirmative or negation?
That's a good question. We get the resolutions themselves right when the semester starts, so beginning of
No. Sorry,
January.
let me rephrase. You knew what the resolutions were. I knew that like ahead of time, but
Correct.
how did you
Gotcha,
know,
gotcha.
like walking into preliminary round one, when do you
Mm,
find out what that debate's going to be on and what side you're going to be on?
right. So for prompt one, we're guaranteed to debate both the affirmative and the negative. So we have cases prepared both, and we're guaranteed to have them. We don't know if we go affirmative or negative until we find out if we made it to the next round. So it's really, really just a coin toss. So after those first two preliminary rounds, all of the ASU teams that advanced had no idea what side they were going to argue on from that point out. It could be one or the other.
But you knew what resolution you were going to have. I mean, you know, like there was the four of them, but you were aware, okay, we know we're going to be arguing AI or we know we're going to be arguing assisted suicide. We
Correct. We
just
just
don't
didn't
know
know what
pro or
side of
con.
the resolution. So we had both prepared. We had statements written, like evidence prepared, questions ready to ask, but we didn't know if we were actually going to run that case until we got that far.
Okay. So, all right. So preliminary round one, what were you and your partner arguing?
My partner and I were on the negation for the AI prompt. The way the resolution was worded was universities should embrace the integration of generative AI in all undergraduate curricula. So we were arguing against that. And we went against these two cool guys from the U of A. It was a really, really fun debate. And then the next round, we knew that since we were in the negation the first round, we knew we'd be in the affirmation. So we had to argue in favor of embracing the integration of generative AI in all undergraduate curricula.
Okay.
So that's how it started.
Okay. And then in the quarterfinal, what did you argue?
So in the quarterfinals, we were assigned to the affirmation. And so again, the resolution was physician assisted suicide should be limited to cases involving terminal illness. So it's a very nuanced prompt.
Sure.
And so my partner and I were arguing in favor of that it should be limited to terminal illness. And again, we had a case prepared for the other side that it should not be limited to terminal.
Okay. Sure. And then in the semifinal, what did you have?
So for the semifinals, we were back on the negation. The resolution was the US should legislate an enforceable minimum age of 16 for all social media accounts. So we were arguing against that. And it just so happened that by the time we got to the semifinals, there were four teams left, and three of them were ASU teams. So we were all really excited to have made it that far, but we knew that two of us were going to have to go against one another. And that's what happened to my partner and I. We went against our friends Alex and Gary, who were on the affirmation. It was still a great debate, but it was kind of tough to know that one of us wasn't going to make it further.
Yeah. And so in the finals, was it you up against another ASU team or was it the other team that made it through?
We were against the NAU team, and again, we were on the negation. And so the prompt, it's I hear that the last one is always intended to be values based, where the other ones were more policy based. So this one was in a democracy, a citizen's moral obligation to be well informed is prior to their right to vote. So it was a really, really interesting prompt. And so my partner and I had to argue against that a citizen's moral obligation to be well informed is not prior to their right to vote. And so, again, we had a case prepared for both sides. This one was a lot more philosophical, kind of drawing on the poli sci bread and butter, Edmund Burke, Alexis de Tocqueville, Rousseau, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and the NAU team took I'll say, a very interesting approach to the prompt, but at the end of the day, we came out on top.
Well, congratulations. I mean, that sounds like what an experience and how challenging. I mean, to have to, to have the four separate prompts like that, and then again to be able to argue both sides of it, which is, I mean, I think one of the skills that we here at the Center for American Institutions try to, build in people is this sort of legal ability, this good lawyer's ability to
Right.
be able to recognize the merits that both sides have and to be able to, in the, I guess, in current parlance, be able to steel man
Mm-hmm.
virtually any side of a debate, which is so important because and this is just outside of debate and Regents Cup competition, but I think just in civil discourse generally, it's so easy to come up with a straw man caricature of what somebody who has a different perspective on you is arguing. And so being able to recognize the merits in their argument, maybe the shortcomings in your own,
Mm-hmm.
not only helps you it helps you argue something better, but I think it also helps you uncover what your own principles actually are.
Agreed. And while that's definitely the approach that we took, that's not the approach that we saw some of the other teams take. And there were, in some teams from NAU and U of A, this straw man approach and some bad faith arguments. I
Hmm.
think part of why Sam and I managed to prevail is because we thought very, very deeply about the issues themselves. We considered all sides, as much of the evidence as possible, and we crafted our cases to incorporate as many of the good arguments as possible. And some teams did follow that approach, but other teams did not,
Hmm.
especially with the assisted suicide prompt. The approach that Sam and I took, we evaluated like assisted suicide on the four bioethical values, which are beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice, talking about how, hey, physician-assisted suicide is really complex. These values often go against each other. Here's the best solution. What we saw from other teams was if you expand physician-assisted suicide, everybody's going to die. My grandma has diabetes, which is a chronic illness. What the negation wants is to kill my mom, and they would make those arguments, which are, if you ask me, bad faith arguments
Yeah.
that dodge the core issues at the center of what we were supposed to debate. And what we saw was that approach doesn't really work all the time, especially when the other side has read as much as they possibly could and is ready with some pointed questions that those kinds of arguments don't address.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that is, first of all, most people who argue on the assisted suicide question, one side or the other, typically making bad faith. There's a lot of bad faith arguments. Um, you know, I'm Canadian, so I'm pretty familiar with a lot of them. Where the issue is probably a bigger political issue in Canada than it is in any other country in the world right now. But I mean, I think your perspective is, first of all, the way that you approached it from a strictly a debate perspective is very interesting, but also just this notion of trying to actually understand what the core values are here, or like what the core principles are, and where
Absolutely.
does this actually um, interfere, or where does this make physician assisted suicide in this particular case more challenging, and where does it and where does it maybe where the again in this case the requirement that somebody not get the somebody who actually wants this, what are the moral implications of not being able to provide it for them.
Hmm. Yeah, it's an incredibly like tender issue, especially because you're arguing over who has to suffer or who has like access to this procedure, and just in addition to the fact that the procedure causes death. So it was It was an incredibly complex issue, and if I'm being honest, it was the one that my partner and I struggled the most with when we were preparing, just trying to figure out the best ethical way to wrap our heads around this issue because we're not doctors, we're poli-sci majors.
Right.
We don't deal with the intricacies of like actual diseases and bioethics and what physicians have to decide, but it takes the best effort possible to try to understand that to make a bulletproof argument in favor or against the resolution.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, actually, in some cases, the fact that you're not a doctor sometimes makes it a little easier. um,
Right.
when, but that sometimes people who are so close to an issue professionally are actually not able to see it in broader societal terms.
Mhm.
Um,
So
but
yeah, while the thrust of the event is to encourage students to really think about these issues, we saw a lot of teams that didn't do that,
hmm,
especially in the final round.
that's
That one
interesting, and it's
was
interesting they made it that far too.
very interesting. I was I was definitely surprised. They were good speakers, but their case was really interesting. If you wouldn't mind if I expanded upon
Yeah,
it for a little
please
bit.
do.
So, just to remind the listeners that the prompt was in a democracy, a citizen's moral obligation to be well informed is prior to their right to vote. And the way my partner and I understood it, and the way we believe the judges and the regents understood it, was when you go to vote, you should know what you're voting for. You shouldn't vote blindly for a party or an ideology. You should know what policies you're supporting and how they're going to affect you and your community. That's how we interpreted it. The NAU team took a very interesting approach, and they opened their case with this assertion that the prompt was inherently racist and bigoted, and that they could not possibly affirm because it incites racist history of Jim Crow laws and literacy tests. And so their entire argument was, we are affirming a resolution in an alternate world where there are no problems with education, and then proceeded to talk about why the federal government has a duty to teach or, or educate all of its citizens so that they are well informed. And so it was a very confusing approach to the debate. And instead of debating the actual philosophy of whether or not a citizen has a moral obligation to be well informed, my partner and I spent the better part of 20 minutes asking them how exactly they defined a moral obligation to be well informed. I mean, the round is on YouTube. I think I asked the question 5 times. And by the fifth time, they explicitly said that they were dancing around the question because they thought that we were trying to get them to agree to a racist history, which is not what we were doing. And again, ultimately, that approach failed and they didn't win the final round. But again, they did make it to second place and they did make it to the final round. So I was definitely surprised. My partner was surprised, especially because we were looking forward to an interesting, good faith debate about a citizen's moral obligation to be well informed.
Sure. Well, I mean, my instinct is that the reason they got so far is that up until that point they'd not encountered somebody who didn't take the bait.
Mm,
And so
right.
one of the ways that you can win a political debate or any type of debate is to say, that might be what you want to talk about, but this is what I want to talk about.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, I know.
And
Definitely going into this competition real quick.
and
Uh,
so if you're not, and it is easy to get sucked into that.
mhm.
And the
Yeah,
reason
they're definitely
the reason you and your partner won is you refuse to get sucked into it.
right. There are definitely two battles that you fight in with debate or even any kind of civil discourse. It's like the disagreement over the issue itself, and then the disagreement over what the issue is. A good friend of mine told me once that if you win the battle over the framing of the issue, then you've won the battle, period.
Right. Right. You want to fight the battle on your terrain.
Correct.
Right.
And
And
it's the same military principle of picking the site and location of the battle and fighting it on your terms. And so that's kind of what we fought against in the final round was no, we are not going to fight on that turf because that's not what the prompt is. And so most of that debate was spent fighting over what the issue was instead of the issue itself. But again, we had to be prepared to do both.
Yeah. Well, that's a but that's a part of debate
Correct.
is trying to, either fully shape the terrain to your own preference or to make sure your opponents don't get to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Absolutely.
well, congratulations. That's fantastic. I mean, again, what a tremendous victory for you and Sam. I can tell you how pleased we are here at the center and how proud we are of you guys for what you did. And I mean, I do like how you brought it back to the Politics and Leadership Club because this is an opportunity. Perhaps it's not a surprise that the president of the Politics and Leadership Club, somebody who deals with political debate, robust political debate on a week over week basis, is so well qualified to go and win the Arizona Regents Cup.
It's definitely very similar to what you have to do as a moderator for those kinds of meetings, especially with the issue of finding out what the issue is. I know as a moderator, I try to let people speak their mind, and I don't really treat myself as a fact checker, but I try to figure out what issues everyone else is talking about and whether or not some people are arguing something completely different versus someone else, and kind of making sure that everyone is on the same battlefield per se. And so having that experience definitely helped going into this competition.
Yeah. Well, again, excellent job. So here, I'm going to exercise a little bit of my prerogative here. And I'm going to say, Jake, okay, you prepared for these various prompts. What? No, you know what? I can slightly change. I'll call an audible. What is the thing that, after doing all of this research and preparing all of these cases, what was what was the thing that you learned about, it can be about any of these policies, that maybe questioned your principles the most, or you found the most challenging that you may have learned?
That's a really good question. And I think I mentioned it earlier, but my partner and I definitely had the hardest time with the physician assisted suicide prompt, just because we thought that either side was ignoring very compelling arguments. Because, again, as I stated earlier, with physician assisted suicide, there are a lot of competing ethical values that go directly against one another. Like, sure, you have to consider the well being of the patient and someone's autonomy to decide what they want to do with their own life, but you also have to consider whether everyone has equal access to medical resources and the duty of physicians to do no harm. They're both exceptionally compelling arguments, and it's very difficult to argue against one because in some ways, regardless of what side you take, you are discounting the personal and severe instances of suffering that some individuals actually experience. And that's a lot of what we read about.
Yeah.
I know we early in our research we came across the case of a Canadian man from Quebec named Jean Touchon, who had spastic cerebral palsy and couldn't move at all for 12 years, and he had constant muscle spasms and pain. He had terrible quality of life, and he asked to be eligible for physician assisted suicide. And so, if you're in the affirmative, you're arguing that no, he needs to be kept alive and the government needs to keep him alive. But then if you're on the other side, you're saying, oh, we should expand it out because then there are issues of physicians pushing assisted suicide when patients aren't necessarily ready for it, or maybe not pushing all the best options like palliative care and so on and so on. And so, to answer your question directly, I think the biggest takeaway is that policy can be messy, but sometimes the best solution is the one that doesn't make everybody happy, but that considers as many viewpoints as possible, even if it's not super popular, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it does make sense. Well, this is one of the things with assisted suicide, that in this particular case, and I remember this particular case in Canada, and one of the things that I think is was always clear is that the patient was not an imminent risk of death. They weren't terminal. I mean, they were terminal in the sense that we're all terminal, but it wasn't, death was not likely in the next 12 months. However, that might have made his case even more scary and more sad because there was very little that could be done for his pain, almost nothing. And he, again, couldn't move, couldn't do anything. All he could do was experience pain. And all he was going to
Yeah.
do for the next several years was experience pain. And so and this case is one of those very difficult ones where, we, if there was ever a case for non-terminal assisted suicide, it's him.
Right.
And yet most of the cases that we hear about in the news are different.
Cool. And so it's a brutal issue
It is.
because, and there are compelling arguments on both sides, and that's the approach that my partner and I ended up taking when we were on the affirmative. We were like, for the negation, yeah, that's a compelling argument, but it's not the only compelling argument. We have to consider as many arguments as possible. We have to consider what the public thinks, what physicians think, and what they're willing to do, in addition to these tragic individual cases.
Sure.
And I think that authentic approach, I think it came off well.
You know what? It turns out that actually acknowledging that it's hard and acknowledging that however this turns out, there's going to be winners and losers, and there's going to be some suffering because they're suffering now. So whatever ends up happening, there's going to be suffering in future. Is that's the only way I think that a responsible citizen can think about these issues. And that doesn't mean that your religious values or your extreme libertarian values cannot implicate and ultimately decide for you. But ultimately what matters is the fact that you can recognize that people can in good faith have very strong feelings on the other side, because there's going to be suffering whatever happens.
Yeah, that's just the reality of it.
And you would have thought, and this is an issue, but there's the other issues do as well. And this is such a great competition because by forcing you to think through it like that, right? I just hope it makes people who go through it more sympathetic to others and empathetic with others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's honestly the best advice I can give for a debate approach for a competition like this is accept the issues for what they are, accept reality, consider all the issues and approach it authentically and how you actually feel about the topic instead of trying to distort the issue or confuse it or use a straw man or hammer home the one thing that you think is going to make your case. Consider everything that you can, and again, approach it honestly and in good faith. And
Right.
If the debate competition is held judiciously and justly, then that strategy will prevail.
Yeah.
Not just in debate, but just in the world.
Right. So, for the negative on this assisted suicide prompt, and could you remind us what the prompt was again?
Prompt was physician-assisted suicide should be limited to cases involving terminal illness. So it was specifically about this terminal illness line.
Right. And I mean, that is the line. That is the most, that is the most heavily debated line in jurisdictions where physician-assisted suicide is currently legal. For those of you who don't know, in Canada, when it was initially brought up, physician-assisted suicide, it was only for those who were terminal. And then there was a massive expansion of it about 5 years ago to those who are, it's not just those who are terminal. And there were other changes made as well, but that is typically in jurisdictions where it's already legal, that is the dividing line, right? So on the negative side, which means you're arguing that it should not just be restricted to those who are terminal, what did you find to be the most compelling argument to you? Not necessarily in debate, but to you.
Well, the most compelling argument to me and in the debate were the same thing. It was that drawing the line at terminal illness isn't the best way to balance all the issues. Our Sam and I's affirmative and negation cases were they're actually pretty similar, and they took really the same overall approach of evaluating the four bioethical principles that I evaluated earlier. We just reversed some of the orders. But what we did is we talked about a lot of the same considerations, like, yes, there's the duty to do no harm, there's the issue of justice, the well being of the patient, autonomy. But we argued that terminal illness isn't necessarily a bright line. And we cited studies that say that doctors can overpredict how much a patient has to live or underpredict how long a
Mhm.
patient has to live in a vast majority of cases, kind of tweaking with, especially with regards to the law, how we define terminal illness. I know in the United States, where it is legal, most states use the timeline of 6 months that you're going to it's reasonably foreseeable that you're going to die in the next 6 months as the qualifying metric. And a lot of the studies that we saw said that in the vast majority of cases, physicians would overestimate by an average of 93 days and underestimate by an average of 86 days, which, if you consider that, that's over a couple months.
So
The
overestimate. What do you mean by
overestimate,
overestimating in this case?
they would predict that a patient on average lived 96 days longer than they actually did. And so when you're considering someone applying for assisted suicide that requires that you have 6 months less to live, we're predicting on average by 3 months is going to make a big deal or a
Right,
big difference,
right. And
right?
yeah, okay, that now I get it. Okay. Interesting. Very
Yeah.
interesting.
And the other argument we used was that terminal illness doesn't really capture the essence of what assisted suicide is for. We, on that side, we argued that assisted suicide wasn't for something that was going to make you die. It was going to be for something that was never going to get better, which is it's a slight reframing, but it makes a difference because it incorporates cases like Jean Touchant's because he had something that was reasonably not ever going to get better. There was no other treatment for it, and so assisted suicide seemed to him like the only option. So that's how we framed it on the other side.
Okay, so how would you have framed it on the affirmative?
With the affirmative, again, we took a very similar approach. We talked about the four bioethical values. We ordered them differently, but what we focused on particularly was this issue of decision making capacity, where if you're non-terminal, the likelihood that you're not going to have decision making capacity is much, much higher. I think the statistics we saw were 2.5% of terminal patients don't have like the decision making capacity, whether because of the pain they're going through or if they have like mental illness as well. So 2.5% for terminal illness, and then it jumps up to 59% for non terminal illness.
Hmm.
And so a key component of physician assisted suicide is the patient deciding to go through it.
Right.
When the patient doesn't decide, someone else has to decide. And that's either the physician or the government. If the government decides, then that's euthanasia. That's not legal anywhere. That's not okay. And if the physician decides, then it's not really physician assisted suicide. It's just a physician putting someone to death.
It's
And so
physician
we
directed.
really focused
Yeah.
on that issue for the affirmative.
Interesting. Yeah. In fact, one of the things that I mean, just outside of the actual um, uh, realm of the actual debate, I'm thinking about the policy debate perspective. Um, One of the things that I've always struggled with physician assisted suicide is the notion that at some point somebody has, obviously somebody has to say, yes, do this to me, right? In all jurisdictions, right? That's not, um, but and that what happens is that they're usually, and I understand that it allows people to have control over something that ultimately nobody has ever fundamentally had control over ever, which is when and how you die, right?
Right.
And that's attractive, I think, to a lot of to most people. I think having the ability to be able to predict when and how. It might not mean you want to do it next week, but like the notion of having some control over that. For instance, if you're terminally ill for a second, you're going to die sometime in the next 3 or 4 months. But like, if I can die next week, it means that like all my family can be in town because they can organize it, and I'll be around.
Right.
Everybody will be around, and I won't die alone.
Right.
Right?
And we saw a lot of evidence that pointed to those arguments as being valid. There were scientific studies that said it benefited the family, it benefited the well-being of the patient. We actually saw some studies that said that just having the option of physician-assisted suicide benefited the patient because it gave them a sense of autonomy regardless of whether or not they actually went through with it.
Sure. But so I mean, I get that argument. I thought, but the on the flip side is this notion that if somebody's not terminal, however we want to define it, and they say, listen, I'm going to do this, and I'd like everybody to be in town next week because it's going to be next week. We'll have a big party, like a big kind of pre-death wake, and I'm going to say goodbye to everybody, and that's what I want to do. So people go before they finally perform the actual suicide. Um, there's always one last question, like, you sure? You sure? You sure? You sure?
And that question is actually required by law,
Yeah,
I
it
think.
is. But here's the problem. I've already brought everybody into town. I have pride at stake in going through with it. And you can't measure that, but how many people decide to go through with it just out of pride? Which is that
Hard to tell.
which is that one human emotion that we probably don't talk that much about in the world, but pride is such a damaging, destructive emotion and causes us to do things that we have that is so against our best interest. And I just wonder how many people, just out of sheer pride, that they don't want to do this, but they end up doing it anyway because they wanted to do it 3 days ago,
Right.
you know. But things did change. They saw their family again. They saw their friends again. They're like, oh shit, I actually have a lot to live for.
Yeah, true. That kind of thing is a lot harder to measure because you can measure how many people withdraw their requests, but you can't measure the inside of someone's head as they're making the final decision, you
Right,
know?
right. Um, anyway, I didn't expect to talk about physician-assisted suicide today, Jake, but here we are.
It's a fascinating issue. And it's one that's not going to go away anytime soon.
No, no, it really isn't. It's here with us to stay. And I mean, we're trying to figure out, I think, as a society, what the guardrails we actually want to put up on this are. I think what we're realizing is that there is a powerful activist community that is so enthralled with the notion of personal autonomy that they don't want any guardrails on this whatsoever because it's up to you what you want to do with your body. And but I think that most people in society don't want it to be that simple. There's some who want, no, you do not have this ability at all, and they've got good arguments for that. I don't think that's where we're going to end up, though.
That's that's actually kind of what we saw in our actual debate. The other side really hammered this argument that you should have the ability to decide what you want to do with your life no matter what. Autonomy, autonomy, autonomy. And my partner and I's response was, well, isn't there an interest to protect the patient from certain physicians that maybe don't follow these ethical values in good faith? Shouldn't there be something to hold physicians accountable? Like,
That's
what
it,
about that?
exactly. There is a case, and I'm not going to bring up her name. I know her name, but I'm not going to bring it up, in Canada, of a physician who is she's an activist on the issue.
Mhm.
She firmly believes that it is like that patients who want to do this should be permitted to do it. And, that's fine. That, okay. I mean, that's what the law says, but it's almost a religious thing. It feels like, when I've heard her describe it, and it feels religious to her,
Mhm.
empowering people to do this and to assist people in doing this. And the numbers that I can't actually remember the euphemism that they use to describe this, but the amount of clients she's had is really, really astonishingly high. And you've got to wonder, how did people end up with her,
That's the scary part
right?
because again, a lot of what Sam and I saw is that not everyone seeks assisted suicide, especially if you're not terminal, to alleviate suffering from whatever condition you have. We saw some data pointing to people who were enduring maybe socioeconomic hardship that sought assisted suicide because they wanted to get out of their situation, or they were disabled, they didn't get the care they would need, or they had past trauma and they didn't get the care that they need, or a mental illness and they didn't get the support that they needed, and they thought that death was the best option, and the physician was like, "Yeah, sure, go for it."
Yeah,
And we saw a similar case in the Netherlands to the kind that you described, where there was a doctor who was providing assisted suicide to patients whose only underlying condition was a mental illness, and these patients were teenagers,
yeah,
so they weren't even 18 yet. And that was the point that we made, is that there's a need for society to protect vulnerable patients from doctors like those
yeah.
because they exist.
Well, I mean, it turns out that a lot of people who want to, society has a long history with suicide. It's not a new thing, right? And it turns out that most people who want to commit suicide aren't doing it because they're terminally ill. They're trying to escape from something, either because they themselves are mentally ill, either because of an acute or because of a chronic mental condition, or an acute one drawn on by some trauma, or sometimes pride. But the uh, and so being able to establish a system. I mean, the advantage to the terminal ill metric is that it, in theory, weeds out all the really hard cases. And that if
In
somebody,
theory.
yeah, in theory, that if somebody who is terminally ill, stage 4 bone cancer, like really bad cancer or something, that is given 3 months to live, decides that I'm going to do it next week. Well, okay, maybe in a perfect world, they were going to live another couple of months, and I would have, preferred them to live the couple of months. If I was taking an arch stance against physician-assisted suicide, but like, okay, so this person lost 2 pretty miserable months of their life. If we were a little like trigger happy on it, this society, it's not great, but it's not, the overall consequences are narrower.
Mm.
But it's when they're not terminally ill, all of a sudden we bring in all of the really hard cases. Every case is really hard.
Right. Well, that's exactly the argument we made. I think in Canada, like the vast majority are for terminal
Yes.
cases. I think it's like 96%.
Mhm.
And of those, a vast majority of that is terminal cancer for people in their late 70s. So that is the bulk of the issue. I think the exact number for non-terminal cases in Canada was like 622 in 2023. So it's not a lot of
No, but
people.
it is
But then
growing, and
again,
we are seeing that grow since
it's
2023. But
growing.
yeah,
Exactly. So, but yeah, there are tons of compelling arguments, and it's again, terminal illness definitely it's the clearest line that we have. But I know Canada is trying this grievous and irremediable standard
right,
for assisted
right,
suicide. So we're kind of seeing how that's
right.
going.
And I mean, that's something that was in, to be fair to the Parliament, that was not a parliamentary directive, that was from the Supreme Court. And so Parliament had to create a law that permitted it to shape it. So it's a bit of a, anyway, so it's a
Interesting.
really challenging, really interesting issue. And Jake, I didn't intend to go down this rabbit hole with you today, so I'm glad we ended up doing that. Just to
Yeah.
wrap up, again, we keep talking about the importance of, and maybe hopefully we, showed the importance of civil discourse there a little bit, even though I don't know how much we disagree, but it was still nice to talk about that difficult issue with somebody. How,
Right.
like, again, more broadly speaking, I mean, I know that Arizona has one of the highest fire rankings as far as universities go. We are considered one of the best jurisdictions for free speech in the United States. Can you maybe speak briefly before the end what the importance of that has been in your education and being able to spend these formative years of college becoming a better citizen?
I think that's a great question, but I'm gonna maybe go the more Jack approach and kind of take a scholarly approach to this question. I've been reading a lot of John Stuart Mill recently, and he has a lot of writings on democracy and how free speech should work in a democracy. And his take is that free speech should be almost unlimited because it's better than shouting people down for having incorrect opinions or unpopular opinions, because there's always the chance that unpopular opinions are actually correct, and there's always more benefit to actually convincing someone with maybe a not so good opinion to maybe see the light and be more productive and change their mind and experience different ideas. And that's definitely what I've experienced as a college student in Arizona, is the opportunity to interact with different ideas and question different ideas and maybe consider the side of different ideas and maybe change my own ideas, because I had the opportunity to speak freely with people who either had similar views or different views, and those people felt like they could speak freely to me and talk about what they believed and how it related to how or what I believe. And I would want to conclude by saying that I see the world pretty differently than when I did before I entered college. And definitely would owe that partially to the fact that there are a lot of people with different ideas, especially in Arizona. We have a very diverse political spectrum. But because we have so many people with different ideas, and because they feel like they have the ability to speak freely, everyone gets to benefit from a getting experience defending their own ideas or maybe changing their own ideas too. And I
Yeah.
think both are equally valuable.
Yeah, I like that's a fantastic answer, Jake. And anytime you can bring John Stuart Mill into a conversation, you know. But anyway, thank you very much. Congratulations once again, and
Thank you.
we're looking forward to seeing Maury and Javi on again soon to talk about something that doesn't involve physician-assisted suicide.
Well, it worked out because I was prepared to talk about that. But thanks again for having me.
Take care, Jake. Thank you.
Thank you.